Hello, everyone, and welcome to the September presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. Our speaker today is Miss Sherry Robinson, a veteran journalist and author. Her most recent book is James Silos Calhoun, first governor of the New Mexico Territory and its first Indian agent. First, her book, I Fought a Good Fight, A History of the Lipan Apaches, won the Historical Society of New Mexico's Fray Francisco Atanasio Dominguez Award in 2014. Sherry will be speaking today on James Silos Calhoun. So welcome, Sherry.
And thank you, Ben, and thank you to the Friends for inviting me today. I wish I could see all of your faces, but those are the times we live in. And speaking of the times we live in, I'm sure you've all read the news and watched the news and wondered if things could get any worse. And I don't have an answer to that, but I do have an answer to a time when they were worse. And we managed to survive that. And that was in around 1850, when New Mexico was transitioning from a jurisdiction of Mexico to occupied territory of the United States after the Mexican War. I got interested in James Silos Calhoun because he was at the pivot point of this very important time in our history. And it's a time that isn't much written about by historians. The records are thin, the images are thin, but that makes it more rewarding when you actually find something. In July 1849, our man James Silos Calhoun, and by the way, I keep calling him James Silas because he is so often confused with John Calhoun. They were not related, but they are confused even by librarians. Anyway, Calhoun arrived in New Mexico that summer of 1849 with his two daughters, a granddaughter, their two husbands, and some friends from Georgia. He'd been appointed New Mexico's first Indian agent by the newly elected president, Zachary Taylor, and instructed to move the statehood process along. 20 months later, he became the first territorial governor. Indian agents were political appointees, but even under the spoils system, Calhoun was surprisingly well qualified. He was a former lawyer, judge, merchant, cotton broker, shipper, and banker. He served in the Mexican War, and he spoke Spanish, unlike most of the other appointees. Santa Fe in 1849 was not an impressive place. Newly arrived Americans found a central plaza of hard-packed clay devoid of greenery. Along with the stores of traders, there were plenty of gambling dens. Unpaved, dirty streets radiated outward, connecting scattered adobe houses surrounded by large fields of cotton. An officer's wife wrote home, "It is the most miserable, squalid-looking place I ever beheld. The houses are mud, the fences are mud, the churches and courts are mud. In fact, it is all mud." The people of Santa Fe were a mixed bunch. There were New Mexicans descended from Spanish and Mexican colonists. There were visiting Pueblo Indians there to trade. There were American soldiers or former soldiers. There were 49ers on their way to California. There were resident American traders who had married into local families. And There were the newly arrived Americans who hoped to make their fortune in this new American possession. They didn't necessarily mix amicably. And I'm looking at this drawing now, and we can see our much abused obelisk here in the picture, which means that it's later than the time period I'm talking about. But like I say, that's the art possibilities are pretty thin for this period. Calhoun made the rounds. He was a gregarious, personable man who was well liked in Georgia, and so we can imagine that he presented himself well in Santa Fe and and met a number of people right away. He quickly got acquainted with Santa Fe's movers and shakers, and he was trying to size up the political situation. Calhoun was a diehard Whig who had been deeply involved in politics in Georgia. He expected to find Whigs and Democrats in Santa Fe. They were present, but national politics played a minor role in Santa Fe. The real issue at that time in New Mexico was statehood. Calhoun found that one group strongly was in favor of statehood, and another group was strongly opposed. The statehood supporters were led by Manuel Alvarez and Richard Waitman. There is no photograph of Alvarez, but I did find a drawing of a Santa Fe trader, and so possibly he looked like this. Alvarez was an educated Spaniard who had lived in Santa Fe since 1824. He'd been a fur trapper and United States consul. When Calhoun met him, Alvarez was a successful trader and merchant with a store on Plaza. He was 5 years older than Calhoun, and the two of them probably hit it off because Calhoun himself had been a merchant at one time. Richard Waitman from Washington, D.C., had served in the Mexican War and after mustering out, returned to New Mexico. He was 24 years younger than Alvarez. Waitman had hung out his shingle and was practicing law in Santa Fe. The Alvarez faction not only advocated for statehood, but protested bitterly the daily injustices of the military government in Santa Fe and its hirelings. Alvarez had the support of native New Mexicans who made up the vast majority of people. In their faction were Whigs and Democrats, New Mexicans, and Americans. This is Job Houghton. The opponents of statehood had a financial stake in the military government as civil appointees or contractors. They also opposed the taxation likely to come with statehood. Their leader was Job Houghton, an engineer by training who'd been appointed a judge by Kearney. Houghton knew nothing about the law. His decisions always favored himself and his own faction. Calhoun enjoyed cordial relations with both factions for several months, but he soon threw in with Alvarez and Waitman. He agreed with their goals and liked the two personally. He was happy for Alvarez and Waitman to lead the faction because in his day job as Indian agent, the government expected Calhoun to manage more than 40,000 Indian people, most of them hostile. In October 1849, Calhoun had sized things up. He wrote a letter to his good friend, Georgia Congressman William Dawson, in which he laid out the obstacles to New Mexico statehood. He asked Dawson to read it to the president and his cabinet and share it with the Georgia delegation. And I show in this book that Georgia had quite a hand in early New Mexico because of Calhoun. We hear a lot about the influence of Missouri in New Mexico, but Georgia was also a big influence because of this man and two other giants of Georgia politics, Stevens and Toombs. So what Calhoun communicated to Washington was that there were basically three obstacles to statehood. First, the military governor, Colonel John Monroe, refused to recognize the actions of the citizens' efforts to create a civil government. Monroe was a Whig, but not a Taylor man. The second obstacle was the Houghton Party's machinations. American Whigs, who were contractors, settlers, and agents dependent on military for their livelihood, had aligned with Democrats, mostly military officers, to support territorial status and oppose statehood. They reflected sentiments of congressmen who wanted territorial governments in California, Utah, and New Mexico. They believed New Mexicans weren't ready for statehood and needed tutoring. Calhoun didn't see why the people couldn't just decide for themselves. The third obstacle he communicated to Washington was the Texas claim to New Mexico land east of the Rio Grande. New Mexicans were adamantly opposed to the Texas claim, but there is some evidence that the statehood party was less opposed. And this is what Texas thought it looked like, this map. Calhoun would have been torn. He believed strongly in states' rights, and the Alvarez faction represented the wishes of native New Mexicans. On the other hand, the South, and Georgia in particular, had long sided with Texans. Georgians fought in the Texas Revolution. Mirabeau Lamar, the Texas Republic's second president, was from the same town of Calhoun, and they knew each other well. More importantly, Southern Whigs wanted to maintain both slavery and the Union. They were willing to give in to Texas claims rather than threaten the Union, and this was Calhoun's position. And this is why he wrote, the United States might be compelled to yield to the claim of Texas rather than endanger the integrity of the Union. Spoken like a true Southern Whig. Now, this map is what New Mexico thought it looked like. In spring 1850, New Mexico delegates created a new state constitution and elected Waitman, a senator, and Alvarez, lieutenant governor. As New Mexicans squabbled over statehood, Congress was doing the same at length. They also argued about whether they should permit slavery in the territories taken from Mexico and how to placate Texas in its demand for half of New Mexico. The disputes were so intense that men armed themselves and some feared violence. Mississippi senators said that if New Mexico continued to resist Texas, blood would be shed. And the combined manhood, quote, the combined manhood of the South would rush to the conflict. Texans were already on their way to New Mexico, according to reports. A furious President Taylor said the Texans must be put down, and he would lead the army himself. But in July, he died, and New Mexico lost its most influential supporter for statehood. Millard Fillmore became president and saw it as his duty to protect New Mexico from Texas. Ultimately, the Compromise of 1850 passed, settling the New Mexico-Texas border the way we see it today, and establishing New Mexico as a territory and paying Texas $10 million for its, quote, loss. Calhoun's Georgia friends, Alexander Stevens, Robert Toombs, and Dawson persuaded President Fillmore to appoint Calhoun governor. And here we have Millard Fillmore's letter appointing Calhoun governor, and which was approved, and his nomination of Hugh Smith, who was a member of the Houghton faction, that one was denied. Once again, Calhoun's friends had a hand in this. Waitman arrived in Washington after the Compromise of 1850 had passed. And so this is what resulted from that. New Mexico Territory included New Mexico, most of New Mexico and present-day Arizona, and a little chunk of Nevada. Calhoun's inauguration was March 3rd, 1851, at the Palace of Governors. In his first two speeches, he made it clear he wasn't giving up on statehood. He championed voting rights. It is our solemn duty so to guard the rights of our citizens that their own votes shall reflect their own purposes. He opposed capital punishment, but he wasn't ready to abolish it. He wanted to outlaw gambling. He wanted Congress to provide funding for schools. And he thought the government should take special care of the weak and the innocent. And this reflects Calhoun's own background as an orphan and a self-made man. New Mexico was still deeply divided. The new territorial status might have pleased the Houghton crowd, but not Calhoun's appointment as governor. He became their new target, although New Mexicans still favored Calhoun's faction. When citizens elected their legislators in May 1851, most were Calhoun partisans. The War Department recalled Colonel Monroe, but his replacement, Colonel Edwin Vose Sumner, was even more hostile to Calhoun. From his inauguration until he departed in May 1852, the enemies of Calhoun did their utmost to sabotage everything he tried to do. They reviled him in the Santa Fe Gazette, the city's only newspaper, which they owned, and in the national newspapers. They lied to Pueblo Indians, saying the government would take their land away. They lied to Comanches and other tribes visiting Santa Fe that the governor intended to have them killed. They spread rumors that New Mexicans and Pueblo Indians planned new uprisings or that Navajos had devastated distant villages. They visited Washington, D.C., and tried to get Calhoun and Waitman recalled. Monroe and Sumner opposed Calhoun in every way, from denying him use of the commissary to denying him a troop escort to visit distant tribes. Calhoun's rapidly declining health in 1852 softened Sumner's attitude, and he showed kindness and courtesy to the ailing governor. Sumner had no use for New Mexico and said it was a waste of tax dollars to defend it, and the Secretary of War agreed. The Houghton faction continued to malign Calhoun in New Mexico and in Washington, D.C., long after his death. They kept up their drumbeat that New Mexicans were uneducated, uncivilized, and unfit to be a part of the United States. It would be a long time before New Mexico could overcome these falsehoods. And you can see this letter here. Someone writes to the St. Louis papers, and the St. Louis papers followed New Mexico news very closely because it was at the other end of the Santa Fe Trail. But anyhow, someone reported that their attempt to maintain a territorial government in New Mexico had failed. And reports like this circulated in the East often, and they were a factor in why it took us such a long time to become a state. Calhoun left in 1852. He was very sick. He was hoping to see Georgia one last time, and he was even hoping to visit Washington, D.C. with a group of Pueblo men, and it didn't happen. He died on the prairie in June 1852 and was buried in Kansas City. And that's a view of Calhoun and New Mexico politics at the time in a nutshell. A lot of this is of interest to me because in my day job, I have been a business journalist for years and years. And I often wondered at why New Mexico seemed to be behind everyone else, why everything seemed to be harder for us. And I think a lot of this, including our dependence on the government, was set up from the outset in the politics of the time, which favored the government running New Mexico so that the contractors could make their money. We continue with the same kind of dependence. We also had here a fairly healthy business climate in the traders in the Santa Fe and Taos, and that set us up for some success. But we suffered from misinformation, from lies, and from outright racism that kept New Mexico from becoming a state until 1912, when we finally joined the Union long after almost everyone else had joined the Union. So the answer to my initial question, we survived this period of time of difficult politics, but I think it scarred us for a long time.
Thank you, Sherry, for speaking to us today about James Calhoun and his role in this most important but lesser known moment in New Mexico history. I personally much appreciated your placing New Mexico politics in the larger context of US politics during this pre-Civil War period. Calhoun's time in New Mexico was a true pivot point in this state's history, as you have pointed out. For our audience, Ms. Robinson's book on James Silos Calhoun was published by the UNM Press in 2021 and is available for purchase from the History Museum's Spiegelberg shop or directly from the UNM Press. Our speaker next month will be Anna Nogar, Associate Professor at the University of New Mexico. She'll be speaking on Ms. Nina Otero Warren, the noted advocate for women's suffrage, who ensured New Mexico ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920. She appears on the recently released fourth quarter in the History Making 4-Year Coin Series being issued by the U.S. Mint, which celebrates women's accomplishments in the U.S. In closing, you can rewatch Ms. Robinson's lecture and past presentations in the Friends of History First Wednesday lecture series on our webpage, friendsofhistorynm.org. If you wish to learn more about all our upcoming lectures, or more broadly about the Friends of History, we urge you to join our mailing list, either via our webpage or by mailing us at nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com. Finally, we request you consider making a donation through our webpage so that the Friends of History can continue this lecture series and support other History Museum programming. We look forward to seeing you in the months ahead. Thank you and goodbye for now.